welcome everyone to the GMA Funder community. This is our kickoff session. And maybe if we could do the next slide here, Gracia.
Good.
Anyway, as I think you all know by now, this is kind of a special effort that we have piloted 2 years in a row now of pooled funding. And we want to really thank all the foundations who came in and supported this effort. We've raised about 180,000 to date. I don't think that number is likely to change too much. And that will result in payment of 80% in the form of grants, or 144,000. That's great. And so I really want to thank everyone there, including our nonprofit partner and kind of fiscal sponsor, Philanthropy Massachusetts, which is acting as fiscal sponsor for a reduced fee. So they also have a vote in final grant making. And maybe if we could move into the next slide. Basically, we'll just do the rules of the road, maybe some first important rules of the road. This session is being taped, and we will share it with anyone who is interested in watching it at another time. This slide pretty much lays out the process where we're really trying to learn a lot and about a difficult theme. And from that learning, we will be in a pretty good position to identify some prospective grantees, which our staff is going to do with your help. And then at the end of the cycle, we will be making grant decisions. And typically, and this is going to have to be a funder decision, we have done largish unannounced grants to a select group of nonprofits. So these have been kind of high profile grants. But it doesn't have to be that way. And I think we will be having discussions on that. And maybe in the next slide. So this is the etiquette slide, but it's basically the spirit of the thing. We're here really to listen and learn and try to learn some things we don't know about. We're going to really encourage participation, but also encourage stepping back and listening to others. And of course, sharing experiences with honesty and sensitivity. I think this is self-explanatory. Next slide. This is our calendar of events. This is conceived as a virtual lunch series. So you can break etiquette by eating over Zoom if you like. We'd really encourage that. Everything's Tuesday, 12 to 1:30. Our next session will deal with the advocacy side of environmental justice, which is very fertile. In September, we'll be talking more about the environment itself as it relates to communities. And we're talking about an urban environment by and large. In October, we're going to hear from some national environmental funders, but we're also going to use this session to figure out our own funding model and to really tee up our short list of nonprofits as best we can. And this will be a kind of a confidential list. And then in November, we will make our grant decisions. Now, attendance at these sessions is not mandatory. We hope that by the time we start reviewing potential grantees, we'll have pretty full participation. With these pooled funds, we have intentionally picked kind of difficult or somehow obscure subjects. So our first one had to do with childhood and adolescent trauma. We learned a great deal. The second one had to do with the opioid crisis. We learned a great deal. And from this process, we think the participants gained enough knowledge and confidence to continue grant making in these areas with this new knowledge. When you look at environmental justice, there might be two elephants in the room. And if you can see on the head of one of these elephants, a little flea, that would be philanthropy within this, huge issue area. We are really just fleas on the head of an elephant here. But the first elephant might be that we're in the middle of a global crisis. It's not just local. This is a global climate crisis. And the second elephant might be that the responses to this global crisis are massive, and they involve government at all levels, and also business innovation going great guns. I every morning read quickly the New York Times and the Globe and the Wall Street Journal. There's not a day in the Wall Street Journal that I don't see something about innovation related to climate change. So, there's so much going on at such a high level, it then becomes kind of difficult for funders to feel they have a place. And I think that's really the point of this session. There's a third elephant in the room, which I think is better understood by funders, and that's the kind of inequality in America that you can find in any urban center. It involves health, education, housing, and the list goes on. But it also involves the environment, and I think we're a little more comfortable with this. We understand that there's environmental inequity going on right here in Boston and in Chelsea, places like that. And we've had good briefings already from the Barr Foundation and the Conservation Law Foundation and Greenwoods, which have really underscored these inequities, and they're huge. And I'm sure you've all read stuff in the Globe on this matter. I think we can go to the next slide. And I will turn it over now to my colleague, Liz, as soon as
Thanks,
this
Phil.
comes up.
Thank you, Phil, and thank you all for joining us today. This session will be held in a dual speaker format. Each speaker will have about 15 minutes to present, followed by a short Q&A session. And I would just ask that everyone take a moment to go ahead and mute yourselves if you haven't already, so we can focus on the presentation. And as we go along, please feel free to type any questions that you have into the chat, and we will get to those during the Q&A. We are joined today by two wonderful speakers, Reverend Mariama White-Hammond and John Cleveland, who I will introduce both of them briefly before we proceed. Reverend White-Hammond is an advocate for ecological and social justice, youth engagement, and spirit-filled organizing. Reverend White-Hammond is the Chief of Environment, Energy, and Open Space for the City of Boston. She is also the founder of New Roots AME Church in Dorchester. Reverend White-Hammond is active in secular and interfaith justice efforts. In particular, she uses an intersectional lens in her ecological work, challenging folks to see the connections between immigration and climate change, or the relationship between energy policy and economic justice. John Cleveland is the Executive Director for the Boston Green Ribbon Commission, a network of business and civic leaders supporting the implementation of the City of Boston's Climate Action Plan. John is also President and a co-founder of the Innovation Network for Communities, a nonprofit focused on social innovation and large-scale change, particularly around climate change response. John recently co-authored a book on cities and climate change called Life After Carbon, the Next Global Transformation of Cities. Without further ado, Reverend White-Hammond, I will turn it over to you now.
Great, it's great to be with you this afternoon, and I will launch right in because I want to make sure that I move through my time quickly and we have some time for engagement. So first, to give some context, I always think it's worth grounding in the frame that I understand our work to be in. And so I talk a lot about this notion of ecological justice. This is not a rejection of climate justice or environmental justice or any other term. It's just a framing in the way that makes the most sense to me. And I say ecological justice because eco means home, And from my perspective, this is our home, the only one we have. I know that Elon Musk is trying to figure out how to get to Mars, but I'm not putting my faith in that. I feel like the best solution is to figure out how we live right in the space we already have. And I think the other point of that is that if we can't do right on this planet, we certainly don't deserve to leave and go start again on another planet. And so ecology as a discipline, as a way of studying the world, what I love about it is that it looks at everything in relationship, in context. It says you can't understand a frog if it is out of the pond in which it lives. And I think that the same is true about humans, and our inability to recognize that is at the heart of the crisis that we're in right now. I think that crisis is deeply tied to colonialism, the notion that we're gonna get on a boat and go take over somewhere else, the notion that we have nothing to learn from the people who have survived in this place for thousands of years. We're going to impose a new way of being on those folks. And in fact, because they don't have the right way of doing it, it's okay to commit genocide. It's okay to enslave. It's okay to devalue folks' lives. And so from my perspective, the climate crisis is deeply tied to the way that we as human beings have been living. It is the outgrowth, the natural outcome of the way of behaving that denies the deep relationships between ourselves and all of our relations, who quite frankly do a lot more to keep us alive than we do in the opposite direction. I am unable to create water. I am unable to produce air and oxygen specifically. These are things I absolutely need to live, and I cannot create them. And yet I live in a society where we pollute water and air as if they are not essential to our very life. And so from my perspective, looking at parts per million in the atmosphere is missing the larger point that we have a society in which people say things like, we can't do that environmentally because it will hurt the economy. Any economy that doesn't value the basic building blocks of life is a problematic economy that should not continue to exist, that is in need of radical transformation if it puts us on the brink of being unable to survive on the only home that we have. So I say that not just to be like sort of highfalutin, but part of the way I do my work, and I try to encourage our staff to do our work, is to never lose sight of those big picture pieces. Because losing sight of those things allows us to make decisions that actually can exacerbate and lean into the same values and systems that got us into the problems that we're in today. So recognizing this crisis as a crisis of relationships, a devaluing of the radical interdependence of life, means that we have to bring that same lens into how we construct new solutions. And we are certainly in a crisis. It is not lost on me, but I think, and I've spent quite a bit of time with scientists. It is clear, and actually they are some of the folks that I think I vibe with the best, because they'll tell you, we've given people all the data and it hasn't made a hill of beans in terms of people's willingness to do things with that data. And so I think I believe in the importance of science. I read it on a regular basis. I connect with those folks and make sure that our facts are correct. But I think it's very important that we note having the right information has been insufficient to move us in this crisis. And the reality is that we are in a moment where a major human evolution is required, not working around the edges, but like a new way of thinking and being and behaving. And those things are created by movements, not by small reform policies. So I want to name that. And I've only been a city official for less than 3 months. Maybe if I've been here a longer time, this will be beaten out of me, but I try to hold this and not get, I pay attention to the bureaucracy. I tell my staff all the time, we're a tiny department. We got to make friends because Public Works has a lot more staff than we do. And Department of Neighborhood Development is going to be more effective at moving our policies than we are ourselves. It is not lost on me. The importance of relationships and bureaucracy and figuring out systems to get things done. But it is worth always keeping in front of ourselves that big picture question that our job is not just to reduce parts per million, but to help facilitate the human evolution that helps us create a society and an economy that is sustainable so that we can live into the future. And I would like, I know, for us to be worthy of that, because quite frankly, if all the rest of the creatures got together and we're like, we got a problem, and if we just get rid of one of us, the rest of us will be all good, they would be right. If there were just one species gone, everybody else would be in good shape. So we got to make sure that we are deserving of our right to survive. So I want to talk a little bit about how we're doing this work, specifically at the city, and then I'll talk a little bit. I don't know if it was mentioned in my bio, I didn't hear. I'm also the board president for the New England Grassroots Environmental Fund. And I know that you all have some more time to talk about specific approaches, but I do think it's worthwhile, since I'm talking to a group of funders, just to also share a little bit of my perspective around how philanthropy can play a particularly unique role in this. So a couple of things worth noting in terms of the city. So probably many of you, if you pay attention to Boston, you know that we've done a really great job on looking at where sea level rise is coming. We have really great maps. They're a little depressing, but we have really great maps that tell us where the water is going to come. We have, in most cases, engaged our most vulnerable communities: East Boston, Charlestown, Dorchester. Folks have already begun mapping out where's the water going to go, how we'll respond to it. Sea level rise, crucially important, particularly in the city of Boston. What I am now sort of saying to our team is we've got to go from knowing where the water is going to go and from having really big plans to figure out how we're going to implement these plans. Because the real challenge is these are multi-million-dollar projects. To do all of them, we're talking in the billions of dollars. And if we do not begin to figure this all out, we could end up in a situation where neighborhoods feel like they are in battle with each other because the clock is running out. And so it is absolutely urgent that we begin to figure out how we are mobilizing these funds. Some we can do at the city level. A lot, we are going to need federal intervention to make this work. Moakley Park, which is right near my house. I live both in a floodplain and in the heat island. I did not do good planning when we bought our house. We should have looked at some of those things. We did not, but I can speak from lived experience. So we are close to Moakley Park. It's the largest park near us. And we're talking $120 million to do a nature-based solution to radically shift what's going on in that. And that will require us to be in conversation with the state and DCR. I mean, there's a lot of work to be done. Now, what we are looking at creating there is amazing. We're talking about a new farmers market space for South Boston. We're talking about raised beds for folks in the community who've been, using space within Old Colony, but could use a lot more. So there's a lot that's beautiful about what could happen there. But if we just have beautiful plans and don't get on top of the advocates we need to start executing those plans, we will land ourselves in a tight position. The other thing that we've really been looking at is extreme heat. I think there's been a lot of attention paid to sea level rise, and rightfully so, it should be. But more people are dying of extreme heat. Extreme heat is, I think people are seeing this right now and its impact in our forests, the impact it has on agriculture, but the impact it has on folks right here in the city of Boston. I know everybody was looking at what was going on in Seattle and Portland when they were really struggling. I was like, I have family in Portland. I'm like, they were not ready for that. They just not prepared for that. But we have areas, particularly Chinatown in Boston, where we don't just have daytime heat, we also have nighttime heat, where there's just no relief. And the big conundrum of how do we make sure that our most vulnerable residents get the access that they need to cooling because they can't live without it? How do we look at cooling for people who have to work outdoors? I am also in charge of parks. So I have many staff people who are required to be out. And when they're not out, I get 311 calls like I got about one of our fields that people feel like is overgrown. We literally couldn't cut it because it's been raining every day. And so staff, get ready. It needs to dry out before we can cut the grass, but it hasn't dried out this entire month. So, all of these challenges that are coming with severe heat, both in terms of quality of life, but also in terms of the dangers in those communities, particularly, we also have high levels of pollution. And so folks already have respiratory challenges that the heat only adds on top of. We've been looking at that, really making sure that people know, talking effectively about what does an equitable heating plan look like, which meant tracking a bit where we had heat. But that is one of the key issues that we need to talk about that I think has not been elevated, and it disproportionately impacts our most vulnerable residents. We've been looking a little bit at food access and community gardens. I could talk about that offline. I also have on my own done a philanthropic effort to move about $200,000 to bring together BIPOC communities and growers across the state. And by growers, sometimes I say grower and people think cannabis. No, there are no cannabis folks we're talking about, but it's gardeners all the way up to sort of people who are doing sort of more commercial growing and people who are doing community farms. And there's a wide range of folks depending on where they are in the state, but really looking at how we bring folks to the table and how do we bring food sovereignty into the conversation, because the reality is these shocks that we've experienced, they're not going to go away. And so helping folks to have a plan about how they might be able to grow in their homes, in their backyards, in shared spaces is an important part of the justice work we need to do. And finally, we've been thinking a lot about the green jobs pipeline, because again, if we only think about the environment and we ignore the economy, we end up in solutions that could replicate the same injustices we're trying to fight. So how do we look at making sure that green jobs are going disproportionately to the folks who've been locked out of the economy as it is right now? And how do we make sure those are good jobs? Because there's a problem if we say no fossil fuel jobs, but you can make $80,000 with a high school degree pumping oil, and then we tell you can only make $30,000 putting up solar panels. That's not an equivalency that people are going to be down with. And so if we don't pay attention to the quality of the green jobs, we're not gonna get people excited and mobilized. And you're gonna have unions continue to push back because they're gonna say, you're asking our people to take a quality of life hit in moving from one economy to another. So that's something we need to pay close attention to. We've been focusing particularly on jobs that are connected in a couple of fields, some of it around landscaping and some around green infrastructure, and then also around buildings, particularly because we have a buildings ordinance that we are introducing, and we want to make sure that there is the workforce to help our buildings shift. And so really quickly, I have no time to talk about philanthropy. But I'll say I hope you will consider inviting the Grassroots Fund, and Julia can tell you a lot about the work we've been doing, but we've been asking a lot of questions. And I'll just say my quick points that I have, which is that the who is as important as the what. When you're talking about issues of power, the question of who is centered in that power and decision-making is as important as what they are going to produce. We look a lot about that. The other thing is for philanthropists to value proximity and really saying, I cannot make these decisions from a distance. I actually need to spend some time connecting with, listening to, getting to know, seeing directly what people are going through, and then together we will imagine what success looks like. Imagine where we're trying to get clear about where we're trying to get, and then backtrack and sort of say, if that's where we want to be in 10 years, where do we have to be in this first year to get there? And then the value, a consistent learning that will be needed, because I'm sure all of you have had the experience of doing strategic planning coming up with some big goals, and 1 year in going, it's still mostly right, but we learned a few things that means we need to tweak this, or else we'll just be trying to fit a round peg into a square hole. And I'm sure you'll have more space to talk about trust-based philanthropy, really valuing different types of expertise and self-determination. But I think, again, a lot of this is, if ultimately we need a human evolution and we need a movement to get there, how are we making sure that the dollars we invest help build community consensus and community power and community mobilization towards the shift that we need, rather than just, sort of doing a project and knowing that we're throwing a pebble into the ocean, and that we're not doing anything. We need to make sure that we're also creating the groundswell needed for the kind of impactful change that we need. So I will pause there and we'll go into questions, and that'll give us opportunity to sort of delve into any areas that folks want to go into more.
Thank you so much, Reverend. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat so far, so please feel free to unmute yourself and jump right in.
Hi, Reverend. I'm so glad that you're here, and your words are inspiring. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about philanthropy and where you see the city and some of the city's funders coming together in this early moment in your work to kind of to light a fire under an initiative, a direction that fits into your overall mission.
Yeah, so I will say one of the things I think we're really looking at is this question around green jobs, because there are some places where folks are actually willing to make shifts and say that they don't actually have enough workers to empower them to do the work that they're actually committed to doing. And so really thinking about some of the sort of market transformation work that's needed. And so that's one place where it's kind of like, we won't be able to accelerate our progress if we don't have the human capital to get us there. And I think the other layer of that is sometimes these are jobs that don't require a college degree, where we actually could have some really strong training and would allow some of the folks in our communities who've been left out to actually have a pathway to a strong job that would also sort of accelerate our climate progress. So I think there's that piece. I know that you all have to balance some lines in terms of where things are federally, but I have to say I am a little concerned that it's been very challenging. Bill after bill, climate has been put out there as something that's going to be in the bill, and by the time the bill comes out, it is severely scaled back. And I used to be, and I'm still involved with Renew New England and Mass Renews and the National Green New Deal Network, and I am concerned because this infrastructure bill was supposed to be the last-ditch effort, and then I found out Sunday night that they're looking at scaling back the climate money significantly again. And so I just think that we need to sit down and I know that people cannot necessarily back candidates, except, but we need to ask what needs to be done so that voters are sort of elevating this. Sometimes it's also things like, and I'm not knocking any other city agency. There are other agencies though that have gotten resources, and we've been sort of saying to ourselves, what do we need to do to make sure that they're building resilience in? You're already going to be doing it, right? So can we build resilience in? So that intersectional thinking is not happening on the scale it needs to be, either at the federal level in a lot of our electoral work, or as much as I would like it to see local. And so I think this question, these are problems, and I know other cities and towns are having them. So how do we begin to think? How do we strategize? How do we really think about an approach that's not either or? It's not the environment or schools, or it's not it's not this or that, but where we're getting it more deeply integrated into all of the work. And I think that's partially a communications piece. And I think it's partially an amplification of places where it's being done well, so that we can also make sure that we are replicating those strategies. I also think that, making sure that our grassroots groups are well resourced, and particularly, and I know there have been a group of funders sort of looking at this. There was a whole reckoning around racial justice that happened last year. And I think for a short burst, there was more resources going to some BIPOC communities. My question is, are they sustained resources? Are they going to be capacity building resources? Because if not, in a year or two, we'll look up and we'll see the same dynamic that was before. And that dynamic is not just problem from like a moral racial justice perspective. It's also a problem because as much as I do work with and love some of the traditional environmental organizations, they have not been able to break through to large swaths of the population, and I don't think they're going to. So if we don't make sure that other folks that bring a different approach, a different message, or talking to a different crew are resourced, well, we probably will continue to see what we're seeing, which is there's a sliver of people that are high in the environmental piece, and a whole bunch of voices that are locked out. Even if they care about it, when they actually make a call to their legislator, they're talking about education, they're talking about childcare, because they too have seen it as an either or issue. So there's a transformation that is not even monetary in terms of how philanthropy frames what it's trying to do. If we're building a movement towards something, then that actually radically shifts where we put dollars and what we invest in. Because I don't think we'll ever have enough money from philanthropy to fix this. It actually would need a radical radical shifting in our national priorities in order to get this done. And so I think a focus on the sort of movement building and advocacy is really, really crucial, because we don't have a lot of time. And what I'm seeing this year, it's just like, we finally have a president who gets it. We had a whole movement, and the dollars still are not flowing.
Thank you. And that's at GMA, I think that's our greatest hope, is that we're able to identify those smaller organizations that we can get behind and that can be the voice that has been missing, that can advocate for some of those dollars that seem to be so elusive. So
yeah. And I think making sure they have the capacity to is where it gets, because, and again, much love to the bigger groups, but nobody calls them when their electricity gets shut off. Nobody asks them to come out because their child got shot. Nobody, and so a lot of the smaller groups that are closer to the ground have competing interests and actually need more resources and more staff to both stay connected to their communities and also have the capacity to respond to those things. And really looking at what are the creative models, are there intermediate, what are the ways that allow those groups to stay on the ground and be responsive? How do we make sure they have the capacity to do both?
Thank you. Any additional questions? I think we have time for one more quick one.
Thank you for sharing, Reverend. It just so happened I was reading a New York Times article this morning, and the headlines was summers in Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. are hotter than Atlanta summers not so long ago, and Boston summer being hotter, or it's as hot as New York summers now.
Yep.
And I'm curious to know what ideas you may have for the equitable heating plan that you mentioned earlier. Something new that I've heard. I'm just curious.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things we're doing. Like here at the city, one of the things that we're doing is we are doing cooling places, right? That we're doing mostly with the Boston Public Library. And we planned them based on where there was a library space and where there was a heat island, right? And so in East Boston, we actually were out there with Chronicle last Friday, and it turned out not to be a rainy day, instead to be a 90-degree day. So that was good for the visuals. And I remember being out there and like a mom who was just walking by, and we had these misters, and she, picked her kids up from the library and she was getting ready to go. And then she like backed up to be back in the mister for a minute. And I think, we're going to need those kinds of strategies pretty at scale. In a lot of places, there are some places where folks cannot stay inside. And then the question, there's the other big thing is the major building retrofits we will need, because people can't live without cooling at this point. There were places in the country where you could live without cooling. I had family in Portland and Seattle. You didn't need AC, there were a few hot days, but you also didn't have 113 degrees. So I think really figuring out what are we doing to enable major retrofits. I just was on a call with mayors across the state who are like really looking at how we can lean into this. We're at the point now where no building should be renovating without deep energy retrofits, like not a single one. And one of the things I would, and I think John will probably talk a little bit about this, we also need philanthropy to be pushing the real estate community, to be pushing the business community, with whom you have stronger relationships than most EJ communities do around these issues. The City of Boston is a longtime partnership and is, sort of co-convener of the Green Ribbon Commission. And we are at this moment of like, we usually call it come to Jesus. I got to find another way to say it. But a moment of truth, right? Where we've issued all these reports, we know what's coming. And the question is our business community courageous enough to say, I know this regulation is going to cost me more possibly. I know it's going to ask me to do things that I have not 100% figured out how I'm going to do right now, but we don't have any other choice. And so I think more problematic than outright climate deniers is people who admit the problem and then are unwilling to push for the urgency of solutions we have. Because climate deniers, I mean, if you're denying still, I don't know what I can do to help you, right? You're up in the heat and drowning and still in denial. Like, pay for a therapist, I can't do anything about that. But there's plenty of people who acknowledge the problem and are still saying we can't afford to do X, Y, and Z. And that's got to shift. So I think, there are more approaches and we are doing what we can for people on the ground. And I think we can continue to talk about that. That's really important. But I do still think there's quite a few holdouts that we really got to figure out how to unstick.
Thank you.
Reverend Mariama, thank you so much for joining us today. I think that, I could listen to you all day talking about this. You have so much knowledge to share, and I look forward to being in touch. I know you have quite a bit going on in your schedule, but please feel free to stay on the line with us if you have the time. And with that, we will move over to John Cleveland of the Boston Green Ribbon Commission.
Great, thanks, Liz, and delighted to be here. And always great to be on any kind of session with the Reverend, who has been a great partner with us before she joined the city, because her father, Ray, has been on the Green Ribbon Commission since its inception in 2010, and Mariama would come to virtually all of our meetings and was pretty well engaged before she actually entered government. So can you make the slide? There you go. Okay. I'm gonna just take a couple of minutes and just do a little bit of, in a way, a little bit more mundane framing than the chief did, just to give you a sense of sort of the role of the commission and sort of where the city is in its climate action planning. And I think the last point that the Reverend made is really critical, is the city is at a critical juncture of transitioning from putting in place some of the best analytical foundations and implementation roadmaps of any city in the country. And now the heavy lifting is actually making those things happen. So you're entering this space at a really critical and interesting and fruitful time. So I'm delighted to see GMA and the foundations getting organized around this, because this is a really critical juncture that creates a need for resources and engagement at the neighborhood level that we have not had to date. So if you could just do the next slide. So real quickly, we, the Green Ribbon Commission, we are a totally voluntary CEO network whose mission is to accelerate the implementation of the city's climate action plan. We typically represent the large property owners, large energy users in the city, commercial real estate, cultural institutions, healthcare, higher education, finance. We have both the utilities, have some NGOs like Ceres, et cetera. So we are not, I really want to have this be clear at the front end, we are really not representative at this point in time of the environmental justice, community-based organizations, and community development organizations. The entities that sit on a Green Ribbon Commission control about 10% of the square footage in the city. So these are very large players. Next slide. The city, we think about the city as our customer. We are not an independent advocacy NGO. We are here to help the city both develop its plans and implement its plans. And we have been deeply involved in both of the major parts of the climate strategy, which are typically referred to as mitigation, aka emissions reductions, and resilience, aka adaptation. So we helped organize and raise funds for the Climate Ready Boston initiative, which is now sort of the foundation for the city's resilience strategies. And then we also did sort of a similar support function on the mitigation strategy. We raised $1 million to do the Carbon Free Boston report, which provided the analysis that led to the 2019 Climate Action Plan update that the city is in the process of implementing. So again, our job is a supportive partnering role, and the point, just again to one of Mariama's last issues, is our job is to make sure that the business and civic leadership understands the scale of change that needs to happen in the city and is willing to step up to support to make it happen. So that's really what our niche is. If you go to the next slide, just quickly for those of you who haven't been immersed in the sort of the climate planning strategy process, on the emissions reduction side, there are three basic things that need to happen simultaneously. One, we need to radically reduce the actual demand for energy, and this primarily, two big segments in Boston are transportation and housing. And just to give you these are rounded statistics, so don't hold me to the details, but the emissions in the city of Boston, about 50%, a little over 50% of it comes from commercial buildings, what they call C&I, commercial and industrial buildings. So these are hospitals, hotels, office buildings, et cetera. About 20% of it comes from the residential sector, the small and multifamily residential sectors, and the other 30% comes from transportation. So when we're talking about all three of these strategies, it's applying to all of those segments: residential buildings, commercial buildings, light duty, which is cars, heavy duty trucks, and transit, buses, trains, et cetera. So all three of these strategies apply to all. So you've got to radically increase the efficiency of our use of energy. We need to electrify as many aspects of these sectors as possible, which in buildings means eventually getting rid of natural gas, fuel oil, and propane for what they call thermal services, which is heating and cooling of a different kind. And in the transportation arena, it means electrifying vehicles, both small vehicles and large vehicles. And then finally, the electrification strategy doesn't work to get rid of carbon emissions if the electricity you're using isn't totally green. And so we need to actually have 100% renewable sources. We do have a good state framework on our side, which is great because there is the Global Warming Solution Act, the recent Next Generation Roadmap Bill that put in really good, strong requirements at the state level to decarbonize the state's electricity grid. So we will benefit from that. But as you can see from this list of things, this is not a trivial this isn't a tweaking of our economy. This is a radical change in how our economy would function if we want to actually get all of these sources to zero by 2050. These big, large systems and our consumer behavior are going to look radically different. So again, as the Reverend said, this is not a small task. This is this is a revolution we need to make happen. If you go to the next slide, the other side of the ledger is us preparing for the kinds of climate disruptions that are already happening. And there tend to be sort of 5 key portions of that the city is working on. One is, getting really good science in place. And we put together a great scientific panel with 9 universities. We are so well endowed with great research universities in the state that are now every 5 years updating the climate forecast for heat, extreme storms, sea level rise, and coastal flooding. We are going to need to build protective structures around the vast majority, the 43 miles of shoreline in the city of Boston. And as Mariama indicated, the sort of the known or estimated bill for that at this point in time is somewhere between $2 to $4 billion over the next 30 years, with a big significant percentage of that needing to happen before 2030, which for infrastructure projects is just like the day after tomorrow. But if we don't do that, we're going to have big chunks of the city, at risk. Making our infrastructure, roads, energy, communication systems resilient, making sure that our buildings can adapt to climate change, and then really embedding these changes in the way we deal with neighborhoods at the community level. So that's kind of the resilience side of the frame, and those activities are led in the. Oh, yeah, okay, great. We can hit this to the point again to several of the points that the Reverend made. Historically, there hasn't been the kind of focus that there needs to be, although both the Climate Ready Boston and Carbon Free Boston processes started it, on the relationship between climate strategies, which tends to be driven by white geeks, and the impacts on neighborhood populations. And so I think the events of the last several years have, particularly the impact of the pandemic and the racial justice reckoning, have suddenly forced folks to connect those two. And so now there really is a focus on the intersection between racial justice, social equity, and climate change. And it means doing things in deliberately different ways than they have done before. It means having intentionally inclusive processes and making sure that the distribution of the benefits and the burdens is done well and is done fairly, but also so that it actually leads to life in the city being better than it was before, so that this is not a sacrifice strategy, but we make these investments in ways that make the city better. For those of you who may have seen the former mayor's Resilient Harbor Boston vision, it was a vision about how if you need to invest in protection of our shoreline, let's invest in ways that increase access to the water, that create additional green space and create additional gardens and create other community benefits while we're actually building protective structures. So it's not just one, it's actually an investment in community quality of life. And then if you go to the next slide, which is just the last piece I'll highlight, is when you drill down to the next level, a sort of, well, what do you mean by benefits, benefits and burdens, and prioritizing benefits and avoiding burdens? There's actually a fairly long, very practical list. And Reverend Hammond's unit in the city of Boston is responsible for making sure these get integrated into the way that the city does its climate action planning. And I want to highlight 2 big sort of opportunities and risks, and then I want to talk a little bit more very quickly about some really interesting opportunities that you as funders might think about. So a resilience opportunity. We have these 5 plans: East Boston, Charlestown, South Boston, Dorchester, and the downtown districts. They're all done. They're great plans. They include about 75 to 80 projects that need to get done over the next 30 years. The question is, how do we prioritize those projects? How do we decide which ones we do first if we have limited resources? What we know is that if you're not intentional about it, resilience investments get prioritized based on the asset value of the property that is being protected. And that has this obvious outcomes. Basically, rich business districts get protected before other places get protected. So we have to be very intentional about that. And we have to create a system that integrates social equity and racial justice into the way decision-making is made on resilience investments. So that's one example. I think the second example, again, that the Reverend also highlighted, we are in the trenches this week on the implementing of one of two really, really important building policies. One is the Building Emissions Performance Standard. The hearing is Thursday afternoon that will mandate emissions reductions on existing large buildings in the city. This will tackle 35% of the emissions in the city, 50% of the building emissions. It's really critical. And at the same time, the Boston Planning and Development Agency are in the process of implementing a requirement for zero net carbon for new construction. So that if you're building a new development, you have to start out of the block with it meeting zero net carbon standards. Those are both great. They're both going to be political heavy lifts. We got to get them done, but they leave 82,000 buildings in the city of Boston, basically untouched by policy. And these are single family residential, triple deckers, and other small commercial buildings that are below the 20,000 square foot level. We need a strategy to retrofit virtually all of those buildings, because when you retrofit, you get the benefits of reduced energy costs, improved thermal comfort, because if you're putting in heat pumps, you also get air conditioning with the heat pumps, and radically improved interior air quality. So we need to build simultaneously a strategy to make that happen across those 82,000 primarily residential buildings. So those are two sort of big opportunities that are, they're part of the climate justice agenda that we have to have. Then sort of getting to very quickly, let me end with just a couple of really interesting opportunities that you have given the nature of the fund that Phil shared the information with me. So there's some very practical things that can be done on the extreme heat arena that are very amenable for foundation-like funding. And a great example is the partnership that the city did with the Barr Foundation last summer, where they got a $50,000 grant. And what happened was they partnered with Boston Medical Center, and Boston Medical Center identified through their clinical processes patients coming in to BMC who were at risk of heat health issues. And then the city used the funding to purchase air conditioners and fans, and then partnered with a local NGO to get those thermal services, if you want to think about them, actually delivered into the individual's house. So there was a merging together of the health and health risks money from the city and the Barr Foundation and community-based organizations who came together to make that happen. So I think that's like, a really terrific example. It's great that food systems are on your list. A thing that we should remember about climate craziness in California is that California provides 2/3 of the fruits and vegetables for the United States of America. Their farming area is estimated to be going to shrink by somewhere in 10 to 15% in the next couple of years because of the drought, which means that food capacity is going to have to get picked up someplace else. So these initiatives like the Commonwealth Kitchen and others that are working on local sustainable food systems are going to have enormous, I think, very, very, very practical implications for food security in urban centers, given the risk that we have to our quote unquote, breadbasket out in California. So I think that's another great area to be focusing on. And you do have Green Roots, who I think you talked to, Phil, in your interviews, who's working on community-based microgrids in both Chelsea and Chinatown, and these both provide reduced carbon emissions, but they also are backup resilient power systems that can keep fundamental emergency services and cooling centers and other things going in these communities if the grid goes down. But to do that is actually pretty technically complicated and difficult to do. If you plan it, you can make it happen, and it has great benefits. But right now, that's, you know, that initiative is being pushed by small, poorly resourced, you know, NGOs who could really use some support. And last but not least, I would just really put in a pitch to consider just basic old general operating support for some of these organizations. In many cases, when you're in the nonprofit sector, it's like the only way you can get money is for a specific program or initiative. When in many cases, a lot of the big things that need to happen require walking around money to build relationships and strategies and collaboration with others that isn't necessarily part of any specific project. And that kind of operating resources is really difficult to get. So I'll end there and open it up. Thank you for the opportunity. It's really great, and I'm just delighted with what you're doing.
Thank you so much, John. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat right now. So again, please, oh, Amy, go ahead.
It sounds from both of our speakers as if a major issue for advocates is that we're going to have to change the locus of decision making. That from downtown to neighborhoods, from big to small, and so forth. And I think that's a really big challenge, given the structure of cities and so forth, and governments. And I'm gonna be provocative here and say, how do we get communities to trust, if you will, the powers that be, where the biggest, most visible change in Boston, I'm going to say in the last 30 or so years, has been the development of massive value in the flood threatened zone. So what do we see but the seaport that we're now going to have to talk about how to shelter? Now, so how do we get from there to we're listening to you and we're acting on your behalf?
Yeah, you know, I mean, I think that's a great question. I mean, I actually think it needs to go beyond the we're listening to you and acting on your behalf. And we need structures that actually, provide residents in neighborhoods some control over the decision making. You know, I think it needs to be more than just advisory. There needs to be some actual structure. And there was a recommendation in the Climate Ready Boston, initial report that, as you do these, they do these district/neighborhood resilience plans, that there ought to be district resilience committees that in fact, are appointed locally and that have some actual control and jurisdiction over how the plan gets implemented and how it's prioritized. I think part of the challenge in the city of Boston, for those of you who sort of followed the development infrastructure for the city, is it has had a very weak city planning function historically, because of the way what used to be the Boston Redevelopment Authority and now the Boston Planning and Development Agency, has worked. And I think there are other cities that have way more highly developed place-based sort of decision-making structures than we have in Boston. We tended to do development in Boston on a project by project, large project by large project basis, which gets you the kind of things that we have in the seaport. So I don't think there's a good answer to that, but I think it's a question that really does need to be asked.
Thanks, Myron, go ahead.
Just following up directly on that, have you looked, John, or others, at the role participatory budgeting could play in implementing some of these climate justice issues at the community level?
I have not looked at that in detail, Myron, but I think that's a great idea. I mean, I've read about participatory budgeting in other cities, and I think that's a perfect kind of example of something that could actually get put in place and change the way it's done. I don't know anything. I should just, express my ignorance here. I don't know anything about the degree to which that tool has been used in Boston or not. So it may have been, but I'm just not aware of it.
I mean, I know several mayoral candidates have included it in some
Yes.
of their campaign approaches. I don't know what level of detail has really been developed about that.
Yeah. And again, I'm not an expert in sort of the neighborhood planning kind of history in Boston. But I think it's kind of, at least my take on it, having talked to some of the, community development corporations and other folks who are involved at the local level, is Boston is actually really a hyper organized city from a CBO point of view. There are a lot of very strong and very active community-based organizations, but there's a relatively weak engagement with the formal apparatus that makes the key investment decisions in the city. So it's a little bit of a, and maybe those, maybe the strength of that network has evolved because of the weakness of the relationship with the city. I think Michelle Wu has been of the candidates has really been the most, strong-willed on this point. She actually wants to get rid of Boston Planning Development State Agency and actually put in place what lots of other cities have, which is city planning department who has a responsibility to do this. And we just don't sort of have, I mean, BPDA sort of plays that role, but they kind of play it in little, they're kind of a little half pregnant on that, which is problematic.
I think we have time for one more question.
John, I remember in my early days at GMA, like 30 years ago, community development corporations were pretty much renovating the city. And there were a lot of neglected neighborhoods where new housing came up, and pretty soon, smart person living on Dudley Street told me there are no more slums in Boston. The problem is fixed. Every neighborhood looks pretty good. When you look at climate and you look at those 82,000 buildings, do you see a real opportunity for this pretty strong network of community development corporations to take advantage of circumstance and really do some major work?
I would say two things about that. One, we really need to have a financing system in place to actually finance the retrofits in ways that work for homeowners. And we are collaborating with the city on the design of a potential Boston Climate Bank with funding from the Bank of America that would hope to do that. So I think we just need to remember that you need to have specialized financing institutions in place if you're going to do retrofits at scale. And then second, I think that we really, and this is just really a tough kind of policy area, is we got to figure out solutions to climate gentrification, what they refer to as climate gentrification. Because part of the problem is, I mean, I grew up outside of Boston and, in Milton in the 70s, and, all the wealth was in the suburbs. Well, now all the wealth is in the inner city. And the problem is the people who work in the city can't afford to live in the city. So the people who can least afford it have to commute in our inefficient transit systems and spend incredible hours and a lot of money to do that. We have got to figure out how to improve the infrastructure, the building infrastructure in the city without, driving prices through the roof and driving continued people out of the city. That is a really, really critical problem to which there are not a lot of great solutions at this point in time. Anyway, you have a great territory you've laid out before yourself. This is really, I think you're going to find this really exciting and really interesting. And I would I would just reinforce two things that Reverend Mariama said. One, don't be afraid to get your hands dirty and go out and actually meet people and spend time with them. Get on the road and get down, into the field. And second, in terms of her point about, leveraging the, civic and business leadership interests in the city, take a look at your boards and make sure that as you do this work, your boards are well educated, because often the philanthropic boards, have a lot of the power brokers on the board. I don't know anything about your foundation, so I don't know how you're constituted, whether they're just family offices or whether you have outside boards. But also, look at your ability to influence through some of your other sort of relational structures that you have in addition to your grant making. I think that would be worth taking a look at.
That's excellent advice. Thank you again for joining us today, John.
Well,
it's been wonderful to have your voice.
Well, thanks for the opportunity and good luck. And I'm sure if there's anything else I can be helpful on, Phil will be giving me a call.
Excellent.
Okay, take care.
Okay, folks, I know we're a little short on time. Thanks for sticking with us here. So just very quickly, I would like us to go around and introduce ourselves. You can just say your name and organization, since we'll be working together for the next several sessions. I'll start. My name is Liz Drury. I'm a program officer at GMA Foundation. And you can popcorn around or I can call on you either way.
I'm Karen Faulkner from the Schraff Charitable Trust Executive Director.
I'm Gracia, and I'm a foundation assistant at GMA.
I'm Myron Miller, trustee of the Herman and Frida L. Miller Foundation.
Dylan Armajani, director of the Lewis and Ann Abrons Foundation.
Great. I'm Phil Hall. I'm with GMA.
There, I am Kelton Archusto, Associate Director of Programs at Philanthropy Massachusetts.
Amy Shorey with GMA, and I staff the Miller Foundation as well.
I'm Judy Sneath, and I'm with GMA. I'm the Director of Communications.
Danielle Belanger with GMA, and I'm a program officer here.
I'm Jessica, and I'm a foundation assistant at GMA. I staff on with Housing Foundation, which funded the Under Community.
Great, thanks everyone. Would anyone like to share their impressions or any key takeaways that they found from this session? And again, we can just kind of popcorn around. Feel free to unmute yourself and chat.
My greatest takeaway is that we really need Mariama White-Hammond in that role to be the glue for the city, with the state, and actually with the different departments. We're working on a road project in my town, and and we're on the water, and there's no resilience built into this Mass DOT $15 million project. So, I just feel that urgency of bringing climate into all of the decisions.
I'll chime in. So I think something that, as I've learned more about this space, that I've found really interesting is kind of how it intersects in so many ways. And I think a piece in particular that Mariama talked about is the workforce development piece, which I don't often associate with climate justice. And so kind of thinking about livable wages and well-paying jobs that go towards making communities more resilient is a new kind of, it seems like a new idea to me. And so I'm really curious to hear and see how that plays out in the months to come.
I would just add a very impressive start to hear both Mariama and John talk about these issues. It does emphasize how vast the challenge is. And I think one of the difficulties for us as a group will be identifying specific investment efforts that can really make a difference, and whether there's some particular sort of innovations that we can help kick off, or groups, whether they're working at at the sort of job training aspects or the community microgrid aspects, or some areas where there's potential for some serious change, is the sort of thing we need to start thinking about as a way to be beneficial in our investments.
I'd like to sort of take what I said before, maybe one step further, and say that I think Mariama has her work cut out for her, because what she is talking about is so fundamental in terms of the power structure of who's got the money and who's building and who these policies will affect, and how you change some of that in a city as where it's so entrenched is tough going. And I'm really glad she's there, but she's going to need a lot of support, not just from us. So it's really important work.
Going along with that, Amy, I thought it was interesting that she stressed how change needs to be created by movements and not just by small reform policies, and that she believes that it's like it says not just us, the philanthropic community, but also reaching to the government as well.
Still seems like a very daunting kind of problem. But, I do feel, just from sort of the research on this and recent experience, that maybe the environmental field itself is changing in a profound way, meaning getting a little blacker and browner. People at the Hyams Foundation, for instance, shared to me a poll of Boston residents. The people who are most concerned about climate change are in the BIPOC community. It's all marginal and everybody is concerned, but people of color are more concerned than white people. I think that's terrific. And here's another little tidbit. You've probably been following this King Boston initiative, which is a multi-gazillion-dollar project, and it's going to include a Center for Economic Justice. Well, Nancy and I were just in a little roundtable this morning on that for the Riley Foundation, which has funded it. This center will be a sort of an incubator for all kinds of community groups. I mean, they're sort of dreaming the equivalent of 10 NAACPs. One of them would be the Boston Climate Progress Design Team. So I think a lot of this control of environmental planning is beginning to go into the neighborhoods in an exciting way. And where it will all lead, we don't know, but it just feels promising to me.
Any final thoughts before we move into closing?
Well, I think we should probably close it up. I think, in a way, this fund is structured to culminate with some grants, and we have already begun to collect a short list of potential grantees. I think what Myron has raised is a very important point, though. You're looking for where, as a private funder, you could have the most leverage. So I would say, among participants, any kind of input you can give us would be very valued. And I mean, we'd even be happy to set up little working sessions if that would move things along. So I think, you know, these typically start off as a little cherry picking exercise. Everybody loves green roofs, so put them on the list. But I think there's sort of more structural questions of how best to fund, which we'll try to figure out through this learning process. But in the meantime, the door is always open. And if anyone wants to really put some thinking into this and with others, that would be much appreciated. Each session is going to conclude with an executive kind of roundtable, so that we can always share people's input there. But I would say, think about this long and hard and stay in touch. And that's about all I have. But does anyone else want to share anything before we close? Are we adjourned, Liz?
We're adjourned. Thank you all for joining us today, and I hope to see you again in August.
Thank you.
Thank you.